Mariatta, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll read Mariatta's bio. She is a Python core developer where she focuses on improving the workflow and documentation. Mariatta is active in the Python community as an advisor for Global PyLadies, co-founder of PyCascades Conference, which is West Coast PyCon conference. And she is currently chairing this past year the PyCon US conference. I believe it's their 20th year anniversary. So Mariatta, for contributions to the Python and Git community, she has received the PSF Community Service Awards in 2018 and Google Open Source Peer Bonus Award in 2017 and 2022. Mariatta, I'll hand the session over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Mariatta, and I live in Vancouver, Canada. So, as Eliza mentioned, as one of the Python core developers, one of my focus area is the documentation and core workflow. So, one of the things that I'm responsible for is the maintaining of our GitHub bots. So, in this talk today, I just want to share of how bots work and show some examples of the bots I've made and show how you can make use of APIs to build bots. All right, so what is a bot? So for me, before I started contributing to open source projects, I don't even know what bots are. Like, I haven't seen them before, only as I started participating in open source projects and joined different communities, I noticed that people use bots in their projects and they have bots in all kinds of bots. So for example, in my first ever contribution to Python, when I make my first pull request, there's a bot that responded to me almost immediately after I open it up. Like somehow this bot knows I have not signed a CLA. The bot automatically posts a message and it also automatically add a label to the PR. So this was one of my first times I've seen some GitHub bots. I joined a different open source community, the Koala project, and they use bots too. They actually use bots on GitHub, GitLab, and Gitter. So Gitter is a chatting platform, kind of like Slack or Discord. So this was an interesting experience for me. When I joined the channel for the first time, I saw the maintainers interacting with bots. So instead of talking to me, they talk to bot. They made the bot do things. The bot does things and talk back to the maintainer. So it was really interesting. I was really impressed. I became interested. I thought that, well, if people can make bots, maybe I can learn and make it myself. So how does bots work? A bot is basically a web application. So in this application, it can run on its own. It can perform tasks on its own. So a bot is a form of automation. So in the examples I've shared, like bots are there, they can automatically write comments on GitHub. It can automatically invite people to chat on forums, automatically apply labels. So a bot is a way to automate your workflow. So how does the bot do things on third-party apps like Gitter or GitHub or Slack? Like, how is it possible for us to have a custom logic that interacts with this kind of third-party services? How can your web app and the third party talk to each other? It's possible because there's an API for that. Like API is what allows the different systems to talk to each other. So platforms like GitHub, they provide APIs that allows you to build your own apps. You can make API calls from your web app to perform automated actions. So if you wanna automatically create a pull request on GitHub. So there's an API for that. You wanna automatically post a message on Gitter, Slack, Discord. There's an API for all of those. So you can make APIs to third-party apps from your web app. What if the other way around? If you want those third-party apps to talk to you, so you want GitHub to notify you that there's a new PR, or you want something like Slack or Discord to tell you that, hey, somebody just joined a channel. Like, do you want to do something about this automatically? And it's all totally possible. The third party service providers like GitHub, Discord, Slack, they can talk to your app. They can tell you about things that happen on this platform. And these things are called webhook events. So if you've heard of it, this is it. So the third party apps will be making API requests on the internet from their service to your web app using webhooks. So webhooks are basically API calls from third party app to you. So I like to think of it as incoming API calls from third party apps to your app. So if you have a web app which can receive webhook events from external services, and then your own app can automatically respond to these events and make API calls. So at this time, you now have a bot. Now you understand that it's all built with APIs. Let's learn on how to work with APIs. The first thing you want to do is really read the docs. And honestly, for myself, the first time I do all of this, I feel like it's confusing. Like documentation is a small word, but it means big. And as a newbie presented with API documentation, it was confusing. There was a lot of links, a lot of different pages, a lot of different sections. Like I was lost. I didn't know how to navigate the docs. So usually, documentation about APIs, you will find them under developer docs. So look for this kind of terminology. Developer docs, that's your starting point for API documentation for building apps. Um, the next is if you're new to this whole thing, definitely look for tutorials on how to use the APIs. But the problem is I found not every providers write tutorials. Sometimes you may need to look for tutorials elsewhere, so not on the service providers itself. If they're good, they'll probably have one. So you may need to read some blog posts elsewhere. Now, after you've taken the tutorial and ready to start building and using the APIs, you can start exploring the other parts of the documentation. You may want to know what kind of API endpoints are available, and you will usually find this list of API endpoints under the resources documentation. The next steps after reading the docs, you want to actually build something and try the APIs out. You need to learn about authentication. So when you make API calls to third-party library, they want to know who is calling their API, and that's why authentication is needed. Usually, this comes in the form of API keys or OAuth 2. Some of them might allow you to use username and password, but I don't recommend you use it. If they have API keys and OAuth 2, go with that, and the documentation will tell you how to do it. One of the mistakes I did with API keys in the beginning, like I ended up committing my API keys to GitHub. Like I was so stupid and a newbie. But what I've learned is don't store your API keys as plain text, and definitely don't commit to your code base. So there are ways to store to encrypt your secrets, and you, instead of trying to hard code the values, try to import your API keys, your secrets, as environment variables. um, Now you read the docs, you got the authentication tokens. Now you can start building and writing code. But there's one more things that you should look into before starting to build APIs. You should find out if there are um, client libraries for working with these APIs. So this is sometimes also called wrapper or toolkit or SDK. So these are all basically client libraries. And the purpose of using client libraries is to provide abstraction and simplification. The client libraries can help hide lower level details like request headers and authorization, things like that. So client libraries is important. However, I also found out that the service providers don't always provide the client libraries. Maybe they have it, but not in the language of your choice. Maybe they have it in another language and not in Python. sometimes you might end up having to write your own client library. Um, and sometimes if they don't provide client library, maybe they also have open API spec. In that case, you will be able to use something like a Swagger client. For the webhooks, so webhooks are basically incoming API requests, and you can use any of your favorite web frameworks for APIs. You can use in Python, you can use Django REST framework, Flask or Fast API or AIO HTTP, anything that you like. And one of the thing when working with webhook events, because it's incoming requests, the same thing when you have to make API calls, there is authentication. You need a way to authenticate or just verify that the incoming requests are indeed coming from the platform that you have set it up for, so it's not from hackers. So usually this is done by setting a webhook secret or by having a specific request headers. This is usually when you set up the webhook with the third-party service. This will be set up at the same time, and usually the client library you use should have this kind of functionality to verify the the webhook request. So if it doesn't, you may need to file a feature request or maybe write your own. Now, you know how to build with APIs. I'll give an example how to use GitHub APIs to build GitHub bots. So GitHub has a pretty extensive developer docs. I do recommend you reading it. Um, GitHub provides different ways to authenticate. You can get a personal access token, and you can also do OAuth authentication. GitHub provides GitHub officially maintains client libraries in Ruby, .NET, and JavaScript, but however, they don't obviously support Python. Therefore, you will find people making their own third-party Python client libraries, and the one that I use is actually written by another Python core developer. So Brad Cannon created the GitHub library for working with GitHub APIs using Python. So I use this library, I contribute to library, and eventually I became a co-maintainer of GitHub library. And because there was no tutorial on how to build GitHub bots using Python, not using GitHub, so I ended up writing my own tutorial for that. So that's the link if you like to learn more on how to use it. In here, I'm showing just a code snippet, an example of how you can use GitHub to open an issue on GitHub. So it's basically a one line. You make a post request to GitHub API. It will look like this, like you pass in the title of the PR or an issue and the body of the issue. Here's an example of how you can handle webhook incoming webhook events using GitHub. So the important part is the first line where you see the decorator router.register issue and action is open. This is where you are basically listening to webhook events for issued opened on GitHub. So another kind of automation that I just made recently is my aquarium cam or my potato cam for when I go on vacation. I just went on trip and I was worrying about my aquarium fish. I was wishing for a way that I could check on my fish while I'm away. So I came up with this idea of using my Raspberry Pi to take photos of my aquarium hourly, and then I want to make it upload the photos to the internet somewhere so that I can look at the pictures from anywhere in the world. So this is my setup. This is how I set it up. So on the bottom left there, you see that's a little module. That's a Raspberry Pi. It's connected to my webcam, which I set up in front of my aquarium. So I wrote Python code for taking pictures, and then I used Flickr, which is a like online album platform. I use Flickr API to upload the photos on the internet. And so I shared my source code there so you can see how it works, and also a link to the Flickr album. So if you're wondering why I use Flickr instead of like Google Photos, when I was researching Google Photos API, the F API, but it does not have Python client library. So it makes it difficult for me to work with it. Turns out Flickr has Python client library. That's why I ended up using Flickr. So it just shows how important it is to have client library when working with APIs. Though after I set this up, testing it with my aquarium, I didn't end up setting it as an aquarium cam, but rather as a potato cam. I actually moved it to point at our potato garden, so we could see how our potato garden is growing while we're away. So yeah, that's the story. And thank you so much for having me here and listening to my talk about bots, APIs, and automation. I really hope this inspires you to do more automation yourself. Thank you so much.
First question, I can see, Mariatta, can you share your thoughts on using APIs for importing and exporting data? Should data analysts like learn how to use API calls? Like recognize as maybe data
Yeah,
engineers.
yeah, I definitely you should use APIs. And one of the things I didn't get to cover it that you when you because people try to scrape data from the internet instead of using APIs. I really recommend you use APIs and follow their when you sign up to use APIs, there may be the terms of service. Like try to follow what the provider allows you to use with their data. So using APIs instead of scraping, it definitely makes it easier for you to get data, and you're doing it, legally instead of, just scraping. And when you scrape, you will have to construct like code, something that, like, you know, usually in Python, people use libraries like Beautiful Soup trying to parse HTML from a website. I think you'll end up writing a lot more code than actually using APIs. You will be able to get data faster and just work on manipulating and analyzing the data. So that's my recommendation.
It's great to hear. I also want to add, like Mariatta, the spirit woman who code. Like you also are a woman who codes. You are the first woman who became a core developer at Python. I think like if people met Mariatta, it's like we repeat this everywhere. But yeah, so you are the first woman like became core developer in the Python programming language and co-founder. I think we also discussed it at our Hacktoberfest for Women Go Python events on YouTube. And yeah, I can see everyone saying like, thank you so much for sharing this information about it. So yeah, like we create a lot of data and like learning how to utilize it. And I'm looking forward to also seeing your potato cam pictures. Oh, yep, we have another question saying, does it get expensive to collect data from API calls? Can you format them to be cheaper?
Oh, so that probably depends on the API providers. I know a lot of them do have rate limiting. For example, with GitHub, um, you are limited to a certain number of calls, but it's a lot. I think like 5,000 API calls per. I don't remember how long, but I remember 5,000. You are typically rate limited, and that's up to the provider, and you might need to talk to them. They might give you suggestions on how to cache or how to make your calls more efficient. Yeah.
So the internet service providers. Yeah. Oh, you have another question. I mentioned you're a core developer. Mariatta, can you talk a bit more about being a core developer for the Python programming language?
Yeah, not sure what you're wanting to hear about, but basically, being a core developer is you become a maintainer of a Python programming language itself, and the process is that basically you do have to start contributing to Python. And actually, there are lots of ways to start contributing to Python. Like for me, I don't write C code like what the internal Python. I contributed to documentation, and those are things are also important. So you just gotta start contributing to Python, and if you've done it a lot, and basically this is the same story when I became maintainer of any library. Like I learned how to use it. I maybe I noticed some typos. Like I started contributing to it to fix the typos. Maybe when I use the library, I use that package, I realized, oh, it's missing features that I want, right? So I ended up filing a feature request, and then I implement the feature I wanted, and ended up getting accepted and getting merged. And you've done this enough times, the existing maintainers will realize, yeah, you've contributed, you seem to understand about our project, or maybe you share the common values of the common goals of these projects, and maybe at that time they'll extend the invitation to become a maintainer. That's how it works for me. And if
Okay.
you're interested in contributing to Python, I do have a talk. Maybe I'll share a link. I did give a talk earlier about how to contribute to Python. Basically, the starting point is we do have documentation called Python Developers Guide. So devguide.python.org. It will tell you about how to contribute to Python, but I will share the link once I found it of my talk and also the dev guide.
Okay, that's great, Mariatta. So also want to add, I saw a common theme on Umanu Code after at the account. A lot of people saying you want to be a better writer, write more. Want to be better at giving feedback, give more feedback. I know for you, it's like Guido, the co-founder or founder of Python, he's like, we need more women developers. He said it twice. You heard him 2 years, and finally you're like, you know what? No one else is stepping up. Mariatta's going to step up, and she did, and she did such an awesome job at it. Although at the time you were like really nervous, but yeah, it's like it's a common theme. Like you want to do it, do baby steps and do it. Yeah. I believe we had time for one more question. Great. So Jacqueline says, great informative answers you provided, Marietta. Their question is, what are some starting types of APIs that can be used for collecting information instead of scraping?
Yeah, so it really depends on the service provider. For example, one time I hear people saying, oh, I want to scrape restaurant reviews from Yelp. Like they want to write their own custom code to scrape that. But actually, if you go to Yelp, they have APIs. So instead of thinking about, I want to scrape data, go see if they have developer docs and if they have APIs. And a lot of time they do. Um, so that's I don't have an example of starting projects for me. Actually, Yelp is a good starting point. What I did was I tried to scrape reviews from Google Maps. I wanted to map out my road trip. I want to map out which restaurants I should go. So I did use Google Maps API, and they have Python. For Google Maps, they have Python client libraries. So I think just think of what kind of projects you want to do, and just instead of starting to think about, I'm going to scrape data, just ask, is there an API for this? And maybe you will find it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marietta. Thank you for joining our closing keynote. Marietta, thank you for this amazing talk. And
thank you.
Looking forward